Does Islam in America represent a threat to Hinduism in America, or does it represent a threat to Hindus being misrepresented in America?
I don't.
What is the need to have a specific Hindu-first organization?
So our focus is on educating the public and the Hindu-American community.
What do you think about accents? If I land up in a new country, like say America, should I just speak the way I speak?
That's a tough question. The second thing is the economy. We are seeing record inflation and high rates of unemployment. And there is this idea that Indians are taking American jobs. But as much as we're seeing this rhetoric coming from the far right, we were seeing those same sorts of tropes being perpetuated by the South Asian left.
We have a Rishi Sunak becoming PM, and suddenly we feel like, oh my God, he's going to do so many incredible things for Indians.
Will they have a soft spot for India? Possibly, because they're Americans first.
Do temples help consolidate and grow Hindu society in America?
I think this is a big question.
Suhag, welcome to Dostcast.
Thank you very much.
I've always wanted to speak to someone like you, and I'll tell you exactly why. I have many Indian friends who were born in America, and some of them find themselves reclaiming a part of their Indian identity when they speak to me, when I update their references and tell them that DDLJ happened in the 90s and time has changed. But they also have this sense of being American and having an amalgamation of values that are both Indian and American that I find myself aspiring to. So it's always a good conversation, and it feels like they fit hand in glove. But that's for my friends and me. I don't think this sentiment is particularly shared amongst Hindus of American origin or Hindu Americans and Indians born in India. I feel like there is a sense of otherness and suspicion through which we look at those who are essentially like us, but we share the same origin countries, but perhaps not the same thoughts and values. Do you think, first of all, do you think this is a common sentiment? Is my reading accurate? And second, what can we do to bridge these gaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll go back to my college days. So one is that I very rarely meet people who are older than me that were born and raised in the United States. My father was part of the earlier immigrants coming, or rather leaving India and going to America. So that was 1964. 1965 brings about the lifting of the Asian Exclusion Act and the passage of the immigration system that we know of today, with some tweaks here and there over the past however many decades. So I grew up in America at a time where there were very few people of Indian origin. Right now, they say that probably around the 80s and 90s, we were maybe hovering around 40 to 50,000 people of Indian origin. And then fast forward to now, the 2020s, and it's nearing 5 million if we're not already 5 million. So I think the landscape has changed significantly. But when I was in college, so this would have been late 80s, early 90s, there was definitely this divide between the graduate students who were the FOBs, the fresh off the boats, and those of us who were born and raised in the United States. We were called ABCDs, American Born Confused Desis. And there was definitely the stylistic, there were definitely assumptions that we had about one another. Graduate students we would look at, and we were not very nice in terms of their dressing style, hygiene, all those things, right? And we were very American in what pop culture we listened to, the way we talked, our food, everything. I mean, every aspect of college life, we were different. And so there were oftentimes two different kinds of college organizations on campus. You'd have the undergraduate Indian Student Association or a South Asian Student Association. We can get into South Asian later. And then there would be a graduate student association. What was interesting is that on my particular campus, I went to the University of Florida. By the time I finished undergrad, there was just the ISA, and then there was a graduate student program. So I can't even recall whether we came together. Maybe some of them attended our events and we attended theirs, but it was very rare that we actually built something together, like a student organization, or interacted in any significant way. And they, of course, had stereotypes about us, that we were clueless, we didn't know anything about Indian culture, et cetera, et cetera. And then on our campus, some undergraduates, by this time I'm in law school, these undergrads wanted to start a Hindu student council. And all of a sudden, it was interesting because out of that Indian framework, all of a sudden we went to Hindu, and graduate students started coming forward saying, oh, well, what are you going to be doing? And, these undergrads were like, well, we'll probably do like some sort of puja at the beginning of the school year, maybe have some Gita readings and discussions, some guest speakers, et cetera, et cetera. And it was interesting that Hindu Student Council all of a sudden bridged that gap somehow. And I recall many of the graduate students, I wasn't involved with the Hindu Student Council because at that point I was in law school, too busy, et cetera. But oftentimes they'd say, oh, wow, you know a lot more than I would have given you credit for, especially when they're starting to have discussions on the Gita or say doing bhajan group or whatever it might have been. So where the cultural aspects of being Indian, whether it's, kind of being up on the latest movies or things like that, where back then the knowledge and access might have been different for ABCDs. We're talking about like VCRs, pre-internet, you don't have access to the latest movies, the latest songs. There was more of a divide. And then, but when it came to the Hindu Student Council, all of a sudden you were out of kind of that pop culture or just cultural aspects where things are maybe more linguistic, et cetera. But you're talking about philosophy. That ended up in some way bridging the gap, which I thought was interesting. Not one that I expected. And so I remember like hearing things from the undergrads saying, well, that graduate student's actually pretty cool. We really connected on XYZ. So it allowed them to kind of transcend those differences. I'd say today those differences are far less because we kind of are consuming the same pop culture in some sense because of the internet, and people are traveling more. There's more undergraduates coming from India to the United States, which is a huge difference. So where you might be interacting, student clubs, et cetera, I think that is definitely a gap that's being bridged.
Yeah. Have you watched that clip where this guy is asked by an interviewer, he's obviously Indian, he says, my name is Santosh?
Yes.
Have you seen that video?
Well, there's a couple of these I've been seeing, like people are getting frustrated with people mispronouncing their names in order to, like, I guess it's a way of code switching,
Yes.
where you're trying to, like,
Yeah.
my name's Viraj or whatever, where these are perfectly easy. Like if you can learn to say the word Schmidt, SCHMIDT, most Indian names are pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a whole phase where I went from, I couldn't say, because we don't make a distinction between saying the letter W and the
V.
letter V.
Yes.
But in America, I had to perfect my V,
Yes.
say it like that. And then I went from Vin to B-Man to VK. But my original friends, most of them Americans, can say my full name, Vinamre.
Yeah.
They say it a little differently.
Yeah.
But I enjoy that. And so I can't even imagine you're an Indian person growing up in America with largely white people and some other black people, and then suddenly your culture has to be molded to fit that.
Yeah.
You, as your name, I mean, your name is Suhag.
I did not go by that in high school.
What was your name?
So I went by Sue because so one, the name Suhag was very hard to pronounce for people.
But they can say the Hag.
Yeah. They would say Suhag,
Uh-huh.
Suhag. I don't know if you remember Popeye. Popeye's way older, but the kind of witch on that was Seahag.
Mhm.
So I would be called Seahag. Then the way that farmers sometimes call hogs in from wherever they're eating, they'll say Suey. So you had Suey, and then they saw hag, but they'd say hog. I mean, kids can be relentless and mean and, just awful to one another. So I think I probably had every kind of mispronunciation thrown at me. The other thing was that my maiden name is Shah. So in the 70s, I would get teased as the Shah of Iran. I
Yeah,
didn't
I
know
was gonna say.
exactly what that meant. So then by high school, where it's really, and I was like a handful of brown faces in my high school. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. My high
Despite that,
school, despite that, because we're talking like 70s, 80s, right?
before the dot-com boom.
Before the dot-com movement. So I'm one of a handful of people of Indian origin in my high school. So I decided to go by Sue. So then I was Sue Shah. That became sushi. So it was like, okay, now you're being called raw fish. I don't know. Like there was no escaping. And so it wasn't until college where I actually ended up meeting a Hindu studies professor who was a family friend of my uncle, who was a professor at the University of Florida. And she gives me this whole long lecture on the roots, the Sanskrit roots of my name, like Suhag from Sobhagyavati. It means auspiciousness, this, that, whatever. And all of a sudden, I'm like, why am I like, this is pretty awesome. So it'll take me a little longer to do my introduction, but why should I change my name? If other people can learn, my parents, English was a second language for them. They learned how to pronounce things. They pronounce it in their own way. So then why shouldn't other people learn to pronounce mine? So I think it wasn't until my freshman year of college that I also then all became exposed to more desis on campus. So that made it a little bit easier. And now I have it down. I tell people, do you know what Haagen-Dazs ice cream is? Most people do. So I'm like, okay, think of Haagen-Dazs, Suhag, and they get it. And so
That's amazing.
I've gotten my short little spiel. I think that's my advice to people is figure out like something that rhymes or whatever to make it easier for other people.
A question perhaps for those who go to America as Indians, born in India. There is a tendency to not integrate or assimilate in American society on campus and often become incestuous among other Indians. And I don't mean necessarily sexually, but I mean just socially you're excluded and you feel like the white Americans, the black Americans, the Hispanic Americans, even people from other countries are others. And you as Indians must stick together. It's a tendency I saw when I was at BU. It's a tendency I still see when I just went back to America again. As someone who's now clearly you have friends on both sides, and you, as someone who heads Hindu American Foundation, you've probably seen what it feels like to live in those two worlds. What would you recommend to someone who's trying to assimilate in American society as a student without necessarily becoming a Santosh?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a lost opportunity to stick to your own. I think there's value in having the comfort and the camaraderie that you have where there's a cultural understanding. It's less of a hike, so to speak, where you don't have to just explain every single thing about why you do things a certain way. I mean, something as simple as like head motions, right? Like this little side to side bob, like you know what that means. You don't have to explain it. All of that. It's just easy. But I think college is a time where you should push yourself. Even working professionals, quite honestly, I have met people who have come on, say, H-1Bs through some sort of tech consulting company, et cetera, where I'm sometimes the first, second generation Indian American that they've met. That to me is a lost opportunity because one, you're not going to learn about the culture. You're not going to be able to learn some of the shared things that we all have as humans, all the struggles, all the highs, the lows, everything. There's so much to learn. If you're in the United States, you should learn about what moves people. You'll also learn that there's no one way of being American. So I think that then you're able to carve out what it means to be an American with whatever hyphen you choose or no hyphen that you choose, right? So I think that when you come onto a college campus, absolutely get involved in your Indian Student Association, get involved with your Hindu Student Council. If you're Hindu, there's Muslim, Christian, there's all sorts of organizations, but then get involved in some sort of like social work. Or if you're into the environment, then get into some environmental climate change type organizations, et cetera, but expose yourself to different types of people, including when you have roommates. That's another way of exploring. That might be a bigger investment, because if you get stuck with a roommate that you don't get along with, that can be painful. But I think there's a lot of ways that you can get involved on campus through trade or, professional organizations that allow you to learn about what other people have gone through, what are their priorities in life. And I think there's much to be gained from that. I mean, my parents did that when they came from India to the United States. My mom learned how to make apple pie and chocolate chips cookies from an Italian neighbor. She went across. My grandmother lived with me. She didn't speak English, but she would take every opportunity, if the neighbor and her were in the hallway together, to try to strike up some sort of conversation. Because, I mean, it should come naturally for us as Indians. We are part of a knowledge culture. So I think you should push yourselves.
Yeah. It's like you're embarrassingly fumbling into connection. And those guys are actually way more courageous, right? Because they would do it without understanding a word of English.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about context switching and accents. When I was in America, I had a very phony American accent because I wanted to be, I was afraid of being different. And I knew at that time from popular culture that the Indian accent was widely lampooned and laughed at. It was easy to mimic and easy to make fun of. And then I did some ayahuasca in LA, and I was like, fuck this. I'm going to go back to my accent. But the twang of that still remains when I speak. And so people in India accuse me of having a phony accent, but I can't help. My sister has a worse accent. She was in the UK, so it's...
it's really confused.
So what do you think about accents? Do you think that if I land up in a new country, like say America, should I just speak the way I speak? And will that deduct my points in the social hierarchy? Will I be looked at differently?
That's a tough question. So my husband, for instance, he code switches all the time. So if he's talking to my parents, for instance, all of a sudden, it's like he just flew in from India and has lived there his entire life. And he has this like kind of, I don't know, Gujarati English accent. And I just can't do that. I speak like this with whoever I'm talking to. I do find that if I'm speaking to someone for whom English is a second language, I might slow down how I talk. I might clip my accent slightly differently. Even here, like if I'm in a car and there's a driver and they're English speaking, I do find that I am changing it. I don't do it in America. So I think to the extent that if you feel that it's going to help the other person understand you, I think intent matters. If you're doing it to be accepted, I don't think an accent makes or breaks something. If someone has some sort of prejudiced view towards you, even with my accent, an American accent, that's not really placeable. I think sometimes if I'm in the South, I do pick up like a Southern twang. If I'm in California, I'll pick up a particular dialect, and I live in Philadelphia. And so there's certain words. So I end up kind of, because I've moved around a lot, picking up accents. If someone is going to make a judgment about you and say they have prejudicial views about Indians, it doesn't matter if I have an American accent, I'm still going to come face head on with those types of prejudicial views. So I say be natural, speak in the accent that helps you communicate and helps you communicate in a way that you're understood. So in the same way that, say, an American might clip their accent or change it a little bit if they're talking to someone from another country, I think it's fair game for Indians to do the same. But again, I think that intent, I don't think you should change your accent because you think you're going to be more acceptable, but maybe more understandable. And that's a different thing.
When I first arrived in America, people started referring to me as brown. And living in India, I had no concept of being brown. Yes. I mean, I'd sort of understood it from, I guess, watching The Simpsons a little bit, that being brown is something. But in India, you don't really look at it like that. You don't really look at people based on race because we just...
Everyone's Indian.
Everyone's Indian. Yeah. It's more ethnicity. It's a little bit more complicated. I don't think we're divided on those lines.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, I saw this kingship amongst Indians and Bangladeshis, Indians and Pakistanis. I don't think it's the case right now, maybe. But I went and met my Shia Pakistani origin friend who's a second generation immigrant, and we did not talk about the Operation Sindoor, or we didn't talk about that at all.
Right.
We're just talking about what we're doing in life. And the reason I bring this up is, if there is already an understanding that, you're brown and I'm brown, in America there's several other people from different nationalities who are also brown, what is the need to have a specific Hindu first organization?
That's a great question. So I think that, we, the Hindu American Foundation, we're an education and advocacy organization. So our focus is on educating the public on Hinduism and the Hindu American community, and advocating for policies that ensure that we have our civil rights protected and are able to freely practice our traditions and be very much a part of the fabric of America. So under an Indian banner, for instance, and this is a question actually that we get from many people in the community, because I don't know if it's just a remnant of, independence and the sensitivities that were around because of the partition on religious lines. But there was definitely a self-consciousness when we first started in 2003 about religious identity. But at the same time, there were conversations that are happening across the United States, post 9/11 especially, that were very much rooted in faith. And there's a lot of issues that an Indian organization wouldn't necessarily take up, because India is a multi-religious, multi-ethnic culture and civilization and country. So, and a community in the United States. So where we might be dealing, say, with a Supreme Court case that is deciding whether public display of the Ten Commandments is an establishment of religion under the First Amendment, an Indian organization is probably not going to be able to necessarily speak from any one particular perspective, right? There's going to be a diversity of opinions. And it's not to say that there's only one Hindu perspective, but from a Hindu perspective, when you're talking about the Ten Commandments, there's obviously theological differences, even legal differences of where one might interpret what the First Amendment means, which guarantees religious freedom in the United States.
Right.
So those are certain issues that you can only take under a Hindu banner. There's others, like how Hinduism is portrayed in K through 12 textbooks or in the media. An Indian organization, of course, there's overlap between Indian culture and Hindu thought, philosophy, practices, culture. But it's not only that. So we felt that it was important to have kind of a voice that could reflect the diversity of the Hindu American community and engage in a variety of platform where other faith-based voices were very active, and a Hindu voice was absent.
In New York City in October, I was walking with my friends, all three of them Democrats, and I saw that I think it was outside a mosque where a bunch of these people who followed Islam had taken over the sidewalk and were praying on the sidewalk. Found that a bit odd, mostly because I don't know what the religious laws are in America about using public space to pray. In India, it's a little different. We have religious processions going out fairly frequently. And it seemed to me that Islam, despite all its terrorism problems, still finds acceptance and is on the rise in America. Now, I'm going to ask this directly. Does Islam in America represent a threat to Hinduism in America, or does it represent a threat to Hindus being misrepresented in America?
I don't think it presents a threat to Hindus in America. To the extent that people don't know the difference between a Hindu and a Muslim, because we're all quote unquote brown, at least, and they're not, all Muslims are not brown and all Hindus are not brown. But to the extent that there's a great deal of ignorance in the United States around religion, I don't know if it's a threat necessarily, but it's definitely an issue. And I think that both communities are working on it as much as we're active in educating, working with the media, working with K through 12, or even just the American public, whether it's corporate America, et cetera, on and law enforcement is another area that we're educating. Many Muslim organizations are doing the same sort of work because in the United States, since you asked about, what does religious freedom look like? It's twofold. The U.S. Constitution, the First Amendment guarantees a twofold promise. One is that the government will not favor any particular religion. And the second is that it won't interfere in any individual's ability to practice religion. So you kind of have limitations on government in order to ensure that you have freedom of conscience. So with any sort of religious processions and things like that, you have to abide by any of the secular laws of, hey, you need a permit to have a parade or whatever limitations there are on time and context. But beyond that, the government can't play favorites between one or another. So if someone is taking up a public access, like a sidewalk, if there's any permits required for doing that, then you're going to have to abide by that. But other than that, you are free to practice your tradition. And you do see processions happening. For instance, ISKCON, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, they every year host a Rath Yatra in many different cities. And so they're getting the parade permits and following whatever requirements there are. And they're able to do that year after year.
Yeah, I did not know that. I can't even imagine what it must feel like to have a Rath Yatra, say, in the middle of, I don't know, down Hollywood Boulevard.
Yeah, I mean, Philadelphia, where I live, one of our main avenues where all of our museums and City Hall, they start at City Hall and they take up the entire avenue, and it goes all the way to our very well-known Philadelphia Museum of Art. At the end of the Rath Yatra, and they're singing kirtan the whole time. I mean, and people are coming, they're curious, but then they have a vegetarian festival or vegan festival at the end of the Rath Yatra. So it proves to be like a really good opportunity to educate Americans about at least one aspect or one particular sampradaya or tradition. And on the whole, Americans are quite open-minded. I think that as much as we, as an organization, tackle Hindu phobia, there are many, many more people who are curious, many more people that engage in Hindu practices already, so are somewhat familiar, namely yoga, meditation, Ayurveda is increasing, awareness around it is increasing. So I think on the whole, those types of things help kind of, it's very participatory. And people can join in and understand and find the commonalities. And especially with ISKCON, of course, it's a large segment of the Hare Krishnas they're not of Indian origin, right? So, it is legal. You just have to have the permit.
Nick Fuentes was actually a college, I would say we're of the same age, and he was in my college. And I had no idea who he would become. And this was my first year of college, and there was a strange debate happening between the head of the Democratic Students Organization at the time and this person who was impersonating Donald Trump. And I went for that debate. It was very interesting. He was a character for sure. And then I saw in the college newspaper that he had transferred to Auburn University, which was, I guess, more accepting of his ideas, to not hearing about him for years. Then all of a sudden, when Trump gets elected, I think he's even more popular than Charlie Kirk, and perhaps is singularly the person that many young white American men and women are looking to. And his followers are called Groypers. And I've been seeing what's happening as a consequence on Twitter, where this anti-Indian hate across the world, actually not just X, also Instagram, YouTube, has increased. Now I'm wondering, is this a consequence of white Christian Americans realizing that this model minority poses a threat? Or is it because we're becoming prosperous, and to bring us down, it's cool to hate on some rather true but unremarkable parts of the large Indian or Hindu population in the world, not just, Hindu Americans?
Yeah. I think it's all of the above. We certainly as an organization have been monitoring this. The first thing I did when X changed the settings so that you could see where someone is based. One of the first things I did, because I would say over probably this last 6 months to a year, increasingly on my timeline, no matter what I post, I have at least a handful of go back to your country. I'm like, well, this is my country. So I went and checked kind of on like the routine posters to see, okay, are they in Pakistan, Bangladesh, or India, or, Nigeria, wherever? And sadly and scarily enough, they're all based in the United States. That said, I think that many of these social media platforms reward this sort of hateful vitriol. I don't think it reflects mainstream Americans at all. That said, there are enough studies that show that vitriol and hatred and violent speech about a particular ethnic minority or religious minority can spill over into real life, into violence. So, for instance, the Tree of Life synagogue that was attacked many years ago in Pennsylvania, researchers have found that there was a spike in anti-Semitic rhetoric, and then it was shortly followed by violent incidents. So we haven't seen that yet, although there are instances of intimidation that are increasing. So there's this huge Hanuman statue in Texas, and we've seen people going in front of the Mandir sign with guns, because Texas is an open carry state, and they're masked and they have an American flag, and they'll post some, demeaning message about go back to your country. We don't need this foreign religion here, whatever, like just some of the ugliest tropes. So there's definitely, there's a couple of ideas that I think that they are kind of rooting this hatred in. One, the false notion that America was founded as a Christian nation. And I think there's enough, I don't want to go into the long and history of it, but if you look at the founding fathers of the country, even some of the earliest people who came to the United States, when they were escaping religious persecution in Europe.
Or just imperial persecution, not just because weren't they all escaping from the crown, not necessarily the church?
Both, but the church and the crown were, you had a official church, right? So not all of them, you're right, but there are many who were escaping religious persecution, or at least someplace where they could practice freely, because they were not necessarily aligned with the Anglican Church, right? So you have that. Then you have founding fathers such as James Madison or Thomas Jefferson, who very clearly said that when Virginia was one of the earlier states to have religious freedom ensconced in the state constitution, and then that became kind of the inspiration for the U.S. Constitution. And there are not necessarily written in the legislative history, but other correspondences where Thomas Jefferson, in kind of expressing his intent behind how religious freedom was defined in this kind of twofold way about, restraining the government from picking favors, picking one religion over others, but also making sure that it doesn't interfere in the inner workings of the church, basically. He said that, we have to envision that this religious freedom has to extend to the Jew, the Gentile, the Mohammedan, and the Hindu, double O. So, was it in the vision of the founding fathers to find a Christian nation? No. There's also there's history around some of the early founders wanting to insert the name of Jesus Christ or some sort of deity, and there was vehement discussion around it. Many people wanted it, many didn't, and ultimately it didn't make it in. So there's that aspect of that America is a Christian nation. The second thing is the economy. We are seeing record inflation and high rates of unemployment. And there is this idea that Indians are taking American jobs. So this idea that, and Indians on the whole have succeeded both economically and educationally. Now, American immigration policy, because it only, the two clear pathways, I mean, of course, there's family immigration, but largely it's education, so college, higher education, or it's high-skilled work. So you already are kind of rigging the system towards success, right? So there's this notion that American or Indians, people of Indian origin, are taking American jobs. Does the H-1B program have problems? Could it be reformed? Are there abuses? Absolutely. I think all of those are legitimate concerns that need to be debated and, fixes legislated. However, when you target just one ethnic group, that's just, to me, sheer racism. But as much as we're seeing this rhetoric coming from the far right, we were seeing those same sorts of tropes being perpetuated by the South Asian left under Biden, right? That somehow Indians are, quote unquote, white adjacent and less deserving of equal protection under the law because we are economically successful, that we are privileged and therefore part of this is very crass, but part of the oppressor class, right? So we already were getting it from the far left, and now we're getting it from the far right. So in some sense, people of Indian origin are kind of stuck in the middle. And I think that one of the solutions is getting more politically engaged, because I don't think the mainstreams of either the left or right believe in this. But right now, it's so hard to have moderate voices heard, right? The algorithms and everything else, they reward the craziest, most extreme sentiments that are being expressed. So I think a little bit of all the above to your question.
Based on my AI's research, you've been helming this organization since 2003. Now, I noticed when Modi became Prime Minister of India in 2014, he did a lot of visits to America where he met with tons of people from the diaspora. And in my own experience, I was very surprised during a vacation in Spain, in Barcelona. I ended up meeting friends of the BJP in Barcelona, which was staggering because these would be mostly Gujaratis who spoke both Spanish, English, and Hindi. Spanish, English, Gujarati, and Hindi.
Right.
How was that happening? How are they lobbying? How are they even doing some degree of political action or even raising money was beyond my understanding. But they seem to be very active, met every single week. Now I'm wondering, what is the ecosystem of diaspora Indians and Hindus that want to fund or support a government in India? How does that work out?
I mean, I think it actually is rooted in Indian law more than I think American law. I don't know if foreign contributions can be made to political parties here, but there is an Overseas Friends of BJP in the United States. There's also an Overseas Friends of the Congress Party, and there's Overseas Friends of a variety of Pakistani parties. How effective they are in terms of lobbying the U.S. government, I think could be the subject of study to see. They're usually volunteer organizations. Now, in the United States, there are laws where if you are lobbying for a foreign entity, and that can be whether it's a political party, whether it's a privately held company, whether it's any sort of entity, you have to register under what's called the Foreign Agent Registration Act, so that there is some level of transparency on the American side to know what is the foreign influence that might be impacting our policy, our narratives in media, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the Overseas Friends of BJP are registered from what I understand. And then that requires some routine filings quarterly or whatever it might be. But none of these organizations are professionally staffed per se. And the type of lobbying that's required. I mean, the United States is definitely a kind of pay to play type system, right? Whether it's paying lobbyists to promote your interests or whether it's making campaign contributions to politicians when they're running for campaigns and that sort of thing. Without someone who's kind of focused on your lobbying interests full time, I think it's very difficult to get heard because the whole system works that way. So you really need to invest a lot of dollars and time and know-how. And at this point, I feel that the U.S.-India relations is really kind of at a diplomatic level. There's less happening at the congressional level. So whether you're going to get a return on investment, I think it's hard to say.
Yeah, we have a tendency in India where we have a Rishi Sunak becoming PM and suddenly we feel like, oh my God, he's going to do so many incredible things for Indians. And then when Trump announced his cabinet, my God, every friend of mine that is interested in American politics was telling me, Kash Patel aa gaya, ab to Indians are ruling, no problem. And then they said the same about Tulsi Gabbard. There's a lot of aspiration and hope in India to see more Indian Hindu faces in American government. It was actually nice to see both Tulsi and Kash, but I wonder if there are specific aspirations or hopes that these people fulfill when it comes to, Hindu American hopes.
Absolutely. I think whenever you see someone of Indian origin, we make up less than 1.5% of the American population. Mm-hmm. And while we've seen wild success in technology, in medicine, in hospitality, entrepreneurship, right? We have seen tremendous success when it comes to a political voice. We are not punching above our weight. So, it was only in, I want to say, sometime after the 2010s when we saw the first people of Indian origin being elected to the U.S. Congress. We've yet to have, there was Kamala Harris, who's half Indian descent, but yet to have an Indian American senator. I think this idea, and this is something that I think so many of the Indian American politicians deal with, is accusations of dual loyalty. In order to to be the president, you have to be born and raised in the United States. You can't have been born outside. But for Congress, you don't need to have been born in the United States. However, they are Americans. They are serving the American people. They are serving their American constituencies. So this idea, yes, they are, I think, people that young Indian Americans, young Hindu Americans can aspire to be. And they are kind of symbols of the possibility that people of Indian origin can very much be a part of political life, civic life in the United States. Where they run into, I think, a double standard are these accusations of dual loyalty. So, for instance, when the prime minister comes to the United States, if Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy meets with him, all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, Raja Krishnamurthy is now the face of Hindutva in the U.S. Congress. But President Obama can meet with him, or Nancy Pelosi can meet with him. And there's no such accusation. So this idea that someone is of Indian origin and has greater allegiance to India, I think is weaponized. Of course, they're going to have a greater contextual understanding, a nuanced understanding, possibly. I take back the of course, but they may have a more nuanced understanding. Will they have a soft spot for India? Possibly. But this idea that they're just automatically going to fall in line with whatever the current interests of India are, I think is naive because they're Americans first. That said, they may end up being champions of a U.S.-India friendship. And on the whole, I would say that they have been. Some are a little bit trickier, like Ro Khanna tries to play, I think, multiple, I don't know if he thinks he's playing 3D chess, I'm not sure, but he's on like the Pakistani American caucus, he's also on the Indian American caucus. And so But I suppose maybe from an American perspective, you can see that there should be positive relations to both. So perhaps it's not 3D chess, but I think those are some of the challenges that Indian Americans face.
Yeah. I think in the last 6 or 7 years, I've been reading how political outlets, how newspapers talk about India. It's hard to find American newspapers talking positively about India. And I wonder why that is. And then I wonder and it's perhaps a hard question to answer because I'm asking you to extrapolate the beliefs of all Americans and say, hey, what do Americans think about India? Like they do in a video where they go on a street. But in some sense, the reason I'm asking this is because it'll help me understand what is a slightly more educated American that you end up meeting in your advocacy circles in the sort of world you occupy. What do they think about India? And in my head, I think we're past the curry, yoga, elephant stereotype. I think we've effectively largely killed that. But then what has occupied the vacuum of that?
That's a tough question. It really runs the gamut. And it actually maps on, at least in my experience, sometimes to whatever political ideology they espouse, and how that might color their view positively or negatively about India. You will meet a lot of people who have lived in India, for instance, did a year in graduate school, et cetera, et cetera. If they are left-leaning, very often I find that they're probably in line with the New York Times version of India or the Washington Post version of India. If they're right-leaning, actually, I don't know that I've necessarily met as many, right? Because all of a sudden you have the Republican Party that's gaining in strength. So, but I will say that when you meet, say, people who are have some sort of roots in some other country that are not your, maybe fifth or sixth generation American. So they come from Israel, or they come from Cuba, or they come from Mexico, wherever. They already know the disconnect between ground realities of whatever they're familiar with and media representations of it. They're going to be a little bit more suspicious of what they read, or a little bit more discerning in getting kind of a diversity of resources that they lean into to learn about India. I would say that the narrative about India is the result of Indians in many ways. Whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post, there's an intellectual class that dictated how India was viewed prior to 2014. And they are the ones who still have access to the New York Times and Washington Post or BBC, and they continue to perpetuate a certain narrative about India. I think it's rooted in, again, political allegiances and political grievances. And so until these outlets, and let me just say this, it's not just about India. I mean, the same can be said if you talk to a conservative American or even a middle of the road center left or center right. They're all going to have the same complaint that media houses have almost like a far left slant. So it's very hard. But now in the United States, at least for American politics, we have a right ecosystem as well. It's very hard to very efficiently get an idea of what's actually happening, because you're going to have to flip-flop between 2 or 3 different channels to get some semblance of what the reality of a particular incident might be. But we don't necessarily see that coming out of India.
You have actually worked on influencing a syllabus and curriculum in American schools. I'm not sure about what Americans read when they read about India in school. I know for a fact that the history books that I grew up reading are no longer the history books that my children will read. with different governments, inevitably comes revisionist history. It's happened long before there were governments, right?
Yeah.
But I'm very curious as to what's the first, when you read about the world in a history book in America and you're a sixth grader or a fifth grader, what do you end up reading?
So in many textbooks, you still read about the Aryan invasion.
Okay.
Yeah. And you learn about the caste system.
Mhm.
You will learn about the arrival of Buddhism as a rejection of the caste system. And then maybe you'll learn about Sikhism, Jainism, possibly. You'll learn a little bit about geography, all in a matter of 10 pages. So
But what about Hinduism?
you learn about Hinduism, but basically it's the caste system. You don't really learn, maybe you learn a little bit about karma, but karma as interpreted through a caste system, a pan-Indian hierarchical oppressive caste system that dictates how all Hindus engage with one another.
That's very simplistic.
Absolutely. It's not even accurate. But this is what students learn about. And the thing is that, so in the United States, education is not centralized. It's not a federal mandate as to what students will learn. Generally speaking, India is going to be introduced through social studies or world history. Maybe here or there, a school teaches geography. Sometimes they teach world religions. Those two latter subjects are a little bit rare as standalone. Geography would be taught as part of history. So you'll be introduced to India, maybe 6th grade, definitely by 9th, 10th, or 11th grade. You have a very rudimentary understanding coming out of elementary school. I mean, I was asked when we first learned about India whether there was electricity in India, whether we had homes or we lived in huts. Now, granted, this is like in 1989 or 1987. And maybe electricity wasn't as consistent, but we did have electricity. I mean, for goodness sakes, it was the 80s. So these are the kinds of ideas that are perpetuated. Still very much a, treating an entire civilization that's a living culture as a museum artifact. And I think that it shortchanges Americans as a whole, because we are in a globalized economy, and inevitably you're going to be either working with someone of Indian origin or someone in India, or at least crossing paths with them, whether you're calling for support for something or another. And the number of people of Indian origin is increasing. So it really has a detrimental effect on identity formation of young Hindu and Indian Americans, because you're not given a story of something to be proud of. Now, we've made a lot of improvements, but they're slow coming because there are, I think, vested interests in academia that have built their entire careers on some of these colonial narratives about India and Hinduism. And so what they'll do is they will demonize any edits or suggestions that are coming from the community as somehow being some sort of right-wing Hindu conspiracy of rewriting. So they kind of conflate what might be happening here in terms of the political push to rewrite history and conflate it with the motivations of ordinary Indian and Hindu American parents there.
Why is Hinduism even considered right-wing in America? I don't understand that. How do you conflate the two together?
It's not necessarily Hinduism that's right-wing, but it's the political party here, right? If the political parties here, as you said, history curricula change with each change in power, right? So it does become intertwined with politics. But in the United States, where you are an ethnic minority being misrepresented in your textbooks, and it has a direct impact on your children, whether it results in bullying down the line in the workplace, because every student is eventually going to be an adult that's participating in the American economy. If it then leads to discrimination or harassment or bigotry towards Indian Americans, the motivations for wanting to get something right in the textbooks is very different. I don't think it's necessarily political. It's almost existential.
Sure.
For our well-being. However, you have the I guess, gatekeepers of what is studied about India and Hinduism in the academy is still held by many leftist scholars, right? They graduated from here, they moved to America, and now they carry with them their political lens, generally a Marxist lens, in the way that they study any topic related to India. And even if they are mentoring American-born students, they're still getting shaped with a particular lens in how, through which to view India and Hinduism.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but is it not evident that the job of South Asian correspondents and caste scholars, and I am against caste, I don't think that caste should exist, but it seems to me that anything that is deeply critical or piercingly ripping apart Indian society is welcomed in the halls of American academia.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that is pro that, unless it's from a spiritual lens, which doesn't have the same rallying or pushing power, is largely ignored.
100%. 100% agree with you. I mean, the number of caste scholar, for instance, fellowships, and it has to fit a particular paradigm, that you are showing a system that's largely oppressive, that's a monolith, that's pan-Indian, without necessarily any exploration into what actually is Indian society about. What's the history of caste? What's the history of a colonial census? None of that sort of work is going to get rewarded. You're one in the United States, you're going to have a hard time finding a mentor if you even want to explore these things outside of kind of the accepted paradigm. So there's a lot of gatekeeping, not only in terms of who comes in to be able to pursue higher studies in these topics, but how you're going to promote them, how you're going to study them, what lens are you studying them through. All of that is quite the uphill battle. And for anyone who doesn't kind of align with the accepted narrative, you're not going to get published in journals. You're not going to be invited to like the key panels at wherever, there's academic conferences, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely there's going to be a professional cost for wanting to do anything that's nowadays, maybe you could call it heterodox, that it doesn't align with this predominant narrative. And we see this predominant narrative then in the media, a largely negative view towards India. There's, I think, very few scholars. Not that I know every scholar, but we struggle for sure in trying to find nuanced studies of India.
Yeah, it's almost like if you try to speak positively about Hinduism, you're somehow a nefarious agent.
Mm-hmm.
But if you dissect it and critically analyze it, technically you're an agent of the powers that be that want it to be perceived that way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, do temples help consolidate and grow Hindu society in America? Like, how important is going to the temple a part of your life or your kids' lives?
Yeah. We have a puja at home, but I rarely go to a mandir. I'll go for Janmashtami or Diwali and, the big celebrations. One is just access. If you live in the city center, oftentimes the mandirs are built in the suburbs because you get more land and all of that stuff. And more often than not, that's where the communities are settling. They're settling in the suburbs. I think this is a big question, an existential question that every Hindu mandir executive that I speak to, board member, a founder that I come across is asking, because most of the mandirs we've had a steady flow of immigration. So you have people coming from India who the mandir serves as a different purpose, right? You go in, you do your darshan, you might, have certain samskaras that you want performed, et cetera, and you go there, you come back. But you're not necessarily looking to the mandir for, say, education, a social network. You might be, but very often than not, people are coming in with friends already or family that's here, so they don't necessarily turn to the mandir for social network. And this is, I don't think you can make broad sweeping claims about that. Many people do build their communities there. But what does a Hindu mandir look like for future generations? I think that is the big question mark that mandirs are asking. I don't know that that question is being kind of cohesively answered. I think you need high quality curricula to teach about Hinduism in a way that makes it relevant to future generations, that shows why preservation of this and practice of this tradition is valuable or provides value. I think that there are opportunities for service so that young second, third, fourth generation Hindus can see the teachings in action.
Yeah.
Right? Because oftentimes what happens, you talk to many, you still see most first generation active in the mandirs. You don't see many second generation. There's always going to be exceptions. So if anyone's listening, they're like, well, no, in my mandir we have blah, blah, blah. But proportionally, this is true. I don't have exact data on it. Hopefully someday we will have data on this. But that's one thing. The second thing is providing the types of programming that second generation are looking for. Because if all of a sudden, and now it's not even a hypothetical, with the changes with the H-1B, for instance, if truly it's going to cost $100,000 for every new application, the largest segment that's been coming in, all of a sudden that immigration just got cut off.
Yeah.
So if you're only serving, if you've been kind of riding the wave of people who are not demanding more, where will you be if that steady stream all of a sudden cuts off? You have to start rethinking, how are we going to meet the needs? It's a question that's asked. I think it's kind of a difficult conundrum because you, I think, need more second generation active in the temples in order to gauge what's going to resonate, what forms of transmission are going to resonate, what language, what type of programming, but they're not there. So kind of figuring out how to even create spaces to have these conversations so that we can start experimenting, I think is the need of the hour. We're in a very different situation than, say, the Caribbean diaspora, which lived in kind of ethnic conclaves. So they had kind of a critical mass, they had proximity and those types of things to help them maintain that connection between a mandir being a place of veneration, but also being a place or a space for community. I think that in the United States, where there are certain areas that have critical mass, but not every area is like that. So it's a little bit more challenging. You also have maybe more linguistic diversity, all of it.
Yeah, it's like, I think in India, just right next to my place, there's 3 mandirs within 50 meters, which is amazing. But I think in this, the Sikhs have done a really good job, where they have the langars, they have the service, and they have congregation and prayer all in one place.
Yeah.
So they're able to sort of preserve their identity. And I'm very curious to see what happens to a Hindu kid who's born in 2025, to second generation Hindu parents in America. And when he or she is of age, what values and rituals will he learn?
Yeah.
Right? Will he attend a havan? Will he be able to discern that his faith is unique? Do you know of any efforts that are being done to make this happen?
Absolutely. I mean, HAF is certainly working on creating kind of resources for parents that are probably, I would say, stylistically, as well as by intent focused on future generations. I think some organizations are doing a very good job, and there are definitely mandirs that are also getting it right, where they have a solid curriculum, they have service opportunity, they have all of that. I would say that those are things that can be replicated. They can be improved upon. Chinmaya Mission, for instance, has a 12th grade curriculum starting from KG all the way to high school. Then they have college programming as well. BAPS, Swaminarayan have the same thing. And you are seeing second generation coming in. Many second generation. So for me, for instance, I learned everything at home primarily until about 8th grade. And that's when Chinmaya Mission came around. And when I started asking questions about why do we do this? Why do we do that? My parents said, we don't really know how to answer your questions in a satisfactory manner. So they enrolled me. And there I found a community that was open to my questions, and they were answering them in a way that clearly it stuck. I went on to dedicate my entire career to Hindu American advocacy and education. Now, my children, we took them to Chinmaya Mission, but we were having a lot of conversations at home to fill in any gaps that we felt where, because most of these organizations are still volunteer run. So it depends on the teacher. Is the teacher open to kids who are questioning? Do they understand the realities of an American teenager who's exposed to drugs, alcohol, sex at a much younger age than maybe they were growing up wherever they did in India or elsewhere? That may not necessarily be the case anymore, but are you addressing how to navigate these social pressures, social challenges, and differences in worldview in a manner that can give young people the tools to navigate this through a dharmic view? I think some teachers do it better than others. So we made it a point to have constant conversations at home about all these different types of issues. And I'll see. I mean, I have a 27 and a 23-year-old. We'll see what religiosity looks like for them. But I do think that there is an interest in things like yoga and meditation that's hard to escape because so many Americans are turning to it, right?
And that's where our philosophy bleeds in to the yoga.
Exactly. So it's not all, I think, gloom and doom. I mean, the average yoga studio is probably more fixated on like lifting your butt and having good abs and whatever else. But there are a lot of yoga studios that do at least try to nod towards the actual purpose of yoga, the spiritual underpinnings of it. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity and also with young people, a growing awareness of mental health. And so many of our traditions, so many of our practices are geared towards managing your emotions, managing the ups and downs, kind of strengthening your lens of equanimity.
The Gita literally is about
everything.
that.
It's all that, right? So I think that there's a lot of opportunity. It's all there. It's a matter of, I think, connecting the dots, relaying it in ways that show its relevance.
I love that the Hindu American Foundation actually has a few guides on Hinduism. I wasn't expecting that.
Yes.
It's an artist's task because you've got so many critics who would tear you down and say, oh, this is not accurate or this, but it's a very good primer, or even someone like me.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
For someone like
Thank you. Yeah. And we're actually in the process of revamping a lot of our things because even we have found that structure of trying to define what Hinduism is still trying to fit a Western definition of what religion is. And, so I used to kind of laugh or roll my eyes like, oh, here's the uncle saying, Hinduism is a way of life, it's not a religion. And I'm like, yeah. It can be both. And it is both, right? As a civil liberties lawyer, it has to be a religion in order to get the protections that all legal structures, international and American.
It can't be Taoism where it's,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly, right? And so there's and in some ways, to say that it can be both is consummately Hindu, right? That
Sure.
we don't necessarily see the world in these binaries, but very much the way that we talk about religion. What is your main text? Who is your founder? When were you founded? All of those things we end up having to answer in the negative. There is no single founder. There is no single text. But what does it look like to talk about the Hindu Dharma traditions on their own merit? And so our senior director of education has a PhD in Indology. He's also a traditionally trained Acharya, and he is helping us revamp our materials. So what he has said, which I'm like, okay, I need to test this because everything I've learned up until now tells me something different. He's like, if you look at any Dharma tradition, it is providing you philosophies, teachings, and practices to help you manage the ups and downs of life. So whether you look at the Hindu Dharma traditions, whether you look at Buddhism, whether you look at Jainism, all of the different practices all go to this main goal of finding balance. How do you live in balance with whether it's a cosmic order, whether it's society, whether it's within the ups and downs that happen within yourself? All of these traditions, all of these teachings are pointing towards that. And that then allows us to lead a good purpose-driven life. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, now I see how this is completely a different paradigm than here's our founder, here's our one book. There's a lot of traditions that actually people will never pick up a book, but it doesn't make them any less Hindu. Right? There are traditions where you don't even have to believe in a God, right? And they're very much a part of the Hindu tradition. So if we limit ourselves to the Abrahamic or Western way of looking at religion, it's going to cut us off from a variety of ways that might resonate with us on an individual level and miss a path that could have been ours that allow us to deepen our self-knowledge and our self-awareness.
You know what I think the answer is? Something that only Hindu Americans can pull off that we won't. We have very sensitive notions about blasphemy in the country. The number of times I have pined for seeing a God of War style video game where you have Nordic gods and you've got Greek gods and you're playing them as characters that have their mythologies and their might intact, but also their fallibilities, is the time I actually learned about the religion end to end, because you inevitably have to borrow from the mythological lore and the stories. There's been a few attempts. They're always shot down. I think there's a gentleman called Varun Maya. He's trying to build an Indian video game that takes place in Mumbai's slums. Bold move, but I would love to see Hindu Americans gamify this, where you could be like a Hindu seeker in a, like, imagine in Suhag, for example, right? And you're or in Patal, and you can do good karma and bad karma, and you meet all the gods. You've got to defeat asuras, and as a result, you learn about the religion. Because I think that I have learned about so many religions without even trying, simply because I was playing the game. And when it's a story-based game with enough action, you passively learn a lot more than trying to read books.
Absolutely.
I
think there's the difficulty with this is, in some sense, first of all, the Hindu Dharma traditions or our ethos didn't have a concept of blasphemy, but somehow people have internalized it, where we routinely will get complaints through our info line like, this company has done XYZ with a Hindu deity, you need to do something about it. Usually it's like a bottle of wine or like a cigarette or whatever it might be. And I think it's a fine balance between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation and what intent is behind it. But being able to give space, see that gamification, people are going to be like, oh, this is a blasphemous use of our deities and how can you do this, right? That all is there. And it's a challenge. I think striking that balance between cultural respect. I think intent matters. We actually have a guide on our website, the proper use of Hindu symbols. And what we come down to is it's the intent. So, and that's not just like some flimsy intent, like, oh yeah, I respect Hinduism and that's why I put Ganpati on a toilet seat. No, that's not what we mean by that, right? But there are certain cultural contexts where within the Hindu tradition, you're not going to put, a picture of Bhagwan on your shoe, or even I've seen yoga mats, right, where you're stepping all over it. There's certain contexts where I think you can do things being respectful of it, but you also need space from kind of the blasphemy police who see any sort of usage, right, as that. I think you need to look at what is the intent behind gamifying something, if it's educational, if it's to create some sort of connection between the individual and the powers of a particular image. I think that we should welcome that.
Like they've made Jesus a joke in all possible languages, where Jesus is sometimes smoking a joint. Sometimes he's just talking as the dude right next door. Sometimes it's just that I don't think that our people would ever allow something like that with our gods.
Yeah, I think we've become sensitive, and rightfully so, because there's so much misinformation and negative portrayals about who we are that until we have enough accurate narratives to counter all the garbage, I don't think we're going to have the confidence to poke fun at ourselves in that way. People might do it quietly, certainly not on a podcast, maybe not on a game where we can poke fun at ourselves, but to do it publicly sometimes falls into the trap of feeding the tropes.
Right. Making it worse.
Right, making it worse. And so I think I understand the sensitivity. I am optimistic because I'm seeing a lot of content coming out from India, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Instagram channels. There's like this one Instagram handle where if Krishna, if this story was a Disney story, what would it look like, right?
Right.
All that kind of stuff, I think it's welcome. It's presenting our stories, our lore in a new format. Are there artistic liberties that are being taken? Absolutely. But I think baby steps are needed for that. And once we hit, enough content that can counter all of the negative, I think we might see a little bit more self-critique, hopefully. I think we need to. It's very much a part of our tradition to debate, to evolve, to adjust without losing certain core values.
Suhag, what is your message to my 10% American audience who's watching this podcast?
Well, selfishly, I'm going to tell them to follow HinduAmerican.org. But I think that we are uniquely placed as kind of torchbearers of an ancient tradition that promotes pluralism, that promotes pursuit of knowledge, and provides a lot of tools to navigate diversity. And for that reason, we are ideal citizens no matter where we go, whether it's the United States, where we can contribute and bring this idea of being able to hold two truths at once, to be able to transcend differences, to work towards solving problems, to also see that we are part of a larger universe that includes plants, animals, other human beings, etc., that we can really take our ethos and bring transformative change to many of the most pressing issues of the day.
Wonderful. It's 4:30 exactly. I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for this very wide and diverse conversation. I had seen a lot of your appearances online, but this was certainly something very new.
Nice surprise that I happen to be in town. So
hell yeah. And thanks to Sanjay Lazar for making this happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so people can follow you on Twitter and American Foundation on Twitter and everywhere else as well. And I'm actually excited to read the website once again because without any biases, I will myself sometimes forget that you should at least have a basic understanding of what it means to be a Hindu, as important as experiential reality and experiencing the everydayness of being a Hindu is. It's important to brush up your basics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And especially because sometimes I find young Hindus perpetuating the colonial tropes. And it's like, have you even bothered to know? And I'm not saying, I'm not one of these people like everything in Hinduism is scientific. Not that by any means. I'm not
or we did everything
uncle
first.
or auntie. We
Yeah.
very affectionately say that being an uncle and auntie is not an age. It's a state of mind. So it's not that, but just explore on your own. Look at a diversity of resources. Don't just throw something out without actually knowing it. Once you know it, you've studied it from all angles. Then if you decide, hey, this is not for me, at least you're making an informed decision. But to just throw it out without actually having explored, I think is a real lost opportunity.
Thank you for your time.
Likewise. Thanks so much. This was great.